Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about Mrs. Bates's knitting. Today, we are excited to welcome Eleanor Gilchrist to the podcast. Eleanor is a postgraduate researcher at Newcastle University. Her PhD project, The Development of Crochet in Britain's Industrial Century, Gender, Craft, and Business, explores the history of the craft of crochet. Eleanor has spoken about the history of crochet at the Making Historical Dress Network Workshop, Replicas, Reconstructions, and Recreations, and at the 2025 Knitting History Forum Conference. And while the history of crochet is her current focus, she got into it via an interest in the history of knitting. She was first introduced to Jane Austen, like so many, through the 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and has been mildly obsessed ever since.
So relatable.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome.
Welcome, Eleanor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Perfect person to talk about knitting in Emma.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to it.
As I said, this episode has us taking a look at Emma. At this point in the novel, Mr. Elton has proposed to Emma and been rejected.
Summarily.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And poor Harriet is now nursing a broken heart. While out walking together, Emma decides to call on Mrs. and Miss Bates with Harriet as a sort of distraction from Harriet's continual musings about Mr. Elton. She's like, anything to distract you? We got to do something.
Okay, so this is from the text. The house belonged to people in business. Mrs. and Miss Bates occupied the drawing room floor. And there, in the very moderate-sized apartment, which was everything to them, the visitors were most cordially and even gratefully welcomed. The quiet, neat old lady, who, with her knitting, was seated in the warmest corner, wanting even to give up her place to Miss Woodhouse. I mean, they are honored. They are so sweet and so welcoming.
Mm-hmm.
I like Mrs. Bates. I've got a real soft spot for Mrs. Bates.
Yeah,
she doesn't do much or say much, but I just think she's quietly taking it all in and doing the best that she can for her family, which I like.
So knitting is a quite commonly known handicraft. I think even most of us who don't actually know how to knit, like the mechanics of knitting, we sort of understand what knitting is and we recognize a knit garment if we see one. But just as a very basic introduction, can you start by providing a general definition of knitting and, maybe a little bit of history? Obviously recognizing that we're asking you to condense a lot into a short period of time.
Sure. I mean, whole books have been written about this, right? So we're going to be doing a wild generalization and a huge oversimplification. So knitting is a way of making a fabric with stretch as opposed to woven fabric, which has no stretch, unless you add modern things like elastin or lycra or spandex. So your jeans are probably woven and you're probably wearing machine-made knit. Right now, if you're wearing a t-shirt or if you're wearing socks, that's probably machine-made knit. But what Mrs. Bates would have been doing was hand knitting, which you take 2 or more needles and a single thread, which theoretically can be of infinite length, and you pass a series of loops through the loops in the previous row. Hand knitting is probably at least 1,000 years old, and it's likely to have been invented in the Middle East or Northern Africa, although it may have been invented more than once in different places. And we have evidence for knitting in Europe from at least the 13th century and in England from the 15th century. And just to be really, really super clear, knitting is not the same as crochet. Crochet is much more modern. It's probably only 300 years old at most, and it's made with a single hooked tool. So does that fulfill your...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Overview?
Absolutely. All right. So now that we have this kind of big picture, we're going to bring it back to Austen. So we get a couple of mentions of Mrs. Bates and her knitting in the novel. But this mention at the top of the episode, with her at home receiving guests, this really paints a scene of what this older woman is doing, right? She's sitting in the corner, working away at her knitting. So can you talk to us about where knitting was situated during this particular time in terms of access and popularity? Who was knitting? Why were they knitting? And what does Mrs. Bates's knitting tell us about her?
So knitting in England started as an industry making caps and then hose, which is socks and stockings. And male knitters belonged to guilds in Europe, and it was considered to be skilled work. And then gradually, as knitting became more ubiquitous, it was devalued. It became associated, like other needlework, with women and became an important source of additional income for rural cottagers. So by the end of the 18th century, so a little bit before Emma was written, the rural knitting industry was in decline. In less affluent households, women and children would still make all of the socks and stockings for their household themselves. But even though the industry was in decline, poor girls were taught to knit as a way of improving them and improving their lot in life. And knitting continued to be a skill that poorer girls were expected to have as part of their needlework repertoire throughout the 19th century. So by the late 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century, knitting began to be taken up more widely by more affluent women. I'm going to just read you a quote from an anonymous author who wrote in the Magazine of Domestic Economy in 1838. Time was when the knitting needles were restricted to the farmhouse and the servants' hall. Of late years, fashion, that all-powerful regulator of everything relating to female occupations, has allowed their introduction to the drawing room, end quote. So we know that Jane Austen and her mother both knitted. Mrs. Austen was in a fairly similar social position to Mrs. Bates. She was the wife of a clergyman, not as well off as she had been. And maybe that's why Jane Austen gave knitting to Mrs. Bates. Knitting was considered to be an appropriate pastime for the elderly and those with poor eyesight because it was not as fine or detailed as plain sewing or embroidery. And it can to an extent be done by feel. So it's the kind of activity that might have been taught to children and then taken up again as an older adult. People were materially literate in a way that's very different today from today. And those skills would have been just in the ether. You know, everyone would know, even if you didn't knit regularly, you would probably know how to knit.
Right.
Like even like muscle memory, like you could pull this back out later.
Yeah, sure. And if you couldn't quite remember, your neighbour would be knitting or there's people knitting around you and it's really, something that would just be around. So what it says about Mrs. Bates is that she's older, is that she's perhaps a little old-fashioned, but it depends what she's knitting. We don't ever find out what Mrs. Bates is knitting, really. So if she's doing the kind of new and fashionable knitting, that would be a kind of fine thread, lacy. If she's doing more old-fashioned knitting, it would be garments for warmth. Not body garments, though. Shawls, socks, caps.
I think what's jumping out to me about this is that, like you said, that there is a kind of stratification here, right? Where the type of knitting that she's doing would be depending on whether she's doing fine knitting or the kind of more like practical knitting. And what I think is fascinating about, again, Mrs. Bates doing this is because even her position in the novel economically is so indeterminate.
Yeah, she's fallen from grace in some ways, but that doesn't mean her skills have fallen. She's still an intelligent woman with thinking and experience in the world as somebody who has been more affluent.
Right. But I think that nuance is so fascinating, again, to think about the fact that, if she is doing something that is more aesthetic, that feels like that's, an aspirational type thing, something that you do for maybe more luxurious reasons. Whereas, because we know that they have a declined economic situation, that there's a very real likelihood that she's doing very practical knitting because they aren't super wealthy.
Yeah. I mean, she could easily be knitting warm socks to wear at night or, and if she'd learnt her knitting skills to do finer work, you could use exactly the same skills to make something warm and practical. Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, it's nuance that I wouldn't have picked out without knowing that there is kind of different functions for knitting within the classes.
It does definitely feel like a very kind of deliberate choice on Austen's part, right? To associate this character with knitting.
Absolutely. And I do think it is really interesting that her own mother was in a very similar economic position to Mrs. Bates, probably a bit more affluent, I guess, but similar, sort of fallen from a higher echelon, and she was a knitter, so she's taken something directly from her own experience and put it into the novel.
Yeah.
So the first mention of knitting in Emma actually comes to us from Emma, the character, in some dialogue between her and Harriet. You know, she's ranting to Harriet about Jane Fairfax, one of Emma's favorite pastimes.
Her many times that she rants
Yeah.
about.
And she says the following: "One is sick of the very name of Jane Fairfax. Every letter from her is read 40 times over. Her compliments to all friends go round and round again. And if she does but send her aunt the pattern of a stomacher or knit a pair of garters for her grandmother, one hears of nothing else for a month."
Her indignation about this.
She has strong feelings about this. Okay, so we can't say for absolute certain that these knit garters from Jane Fairfax actually exist, because Emma's kind of on a tear here. I mean, this could be a real thing that she heard about, or she could just be providing likely examples to prove her point. But since we know that Mrs. Bates knits, is it likely that she passed the skill along to Jane, since Jane did live with them, right, for quite a period of time when she was younger, before she left to go stay with the Campbells? Or is this a skill that Jane would have learned as part of her education with the Campbells?
Sure. So we know that Jane went to live with her aunt and her grandmother when she was 3, and then she moved to live with the Campbells when she was 9. So there's every chance that Mrs. Bates could have taught her to knit in that period. I learned to knit in between those two ages. I learned when I was about 7. And then Jane does come back and visit periodically in her childhood. So that would provide possibility for additional lessons. And children often want to copy what the adults in their life are doing. I wanted to learn to knit because my grandmother could knit. You know, she taught me. So I think that's quite likely. I don't think that the idea that Jane was knitting would have been a dig from Emma in of itself, because it was such a widespread skill. I don't think the knitting itself she would have considered, like, I don't know, lowly or something. But it probably wasn't widely considered an accomplishment when Jane and Emma were growing up. It probably wasn't that yet. But if Jane had gone on to become a governess, which obviously she doesn't at the end of the book, but if she had done, it would soon have become something that she would have been expected to teach to her own charges. I mean, we know, for example, that Princess Victoria, who went on to become Queen Victoria, who was born in 1819, she was taught to knit and crochet and sew as a child. There's very strong evidence for that. As for the knitting the garters, first of all, we should probably clarify that a garter is exactly what you might think it is. It's a band of fabric that's stretchy, that fits around the leg to hold up the top of a sock or a stocking. And there wasn't elastic like you put in your clothes now, didn't exist then. So a knitted garter would have been a very practical item. And knitting patterns weren't routinely published until the 1840s. But in the knitting and crochet manuals I've studied from the 1840s, from that decade, there are 2 patterns for garters, which, like many early patterns, are not very clear to the modern reader. And they tend to leave out a lot of the information we would expect to find in a pattern now.
It's like when you try to look at a recipe for this time period and it's just like, make the soup. You're like, that's helpful.
So, but I can give you the links to put in the show notes. So if anyone wants to have a look, those books have been digitized and they're free to access. So you can people can have a look and see what a garter pattern would look like.
I'm assuming the reason they leave out a lot of the instruction is because they just assume that you understand at least the basics of knitting at this point.
Partly. So none of these books try and teach you to knit. They do try and teach you to crochet, because crochet is a new skill at this point, or a newly fashionable skill. But the earliest knitting and crochet patterns, this is my personal TED talk.
I love this. Give it to us.
The earliest knitting and crochet patterns, the written pattern is a new technology. So they didn't know how to write a pattern. So if you imagine trying to sit down and explain how to do a really like haptic hands-on skill, like make a jam sandwich, if you try and write it down how to do that, actually that's a really hard thing to do.
Right.
And so the earliest patterns are really awful. They're not clear. There's lots of mistakes. They leave out loads of information you really need. By the end of the 1840s, they start looking much more like what you would expect to see now, where you start with the materials and the tools, and then it tells you what to do first, and then the steps are in chronological order, and then it tells you how to finish. Well, that in itself needed work to get to that point.
Sure. Yeah. Once you point that out, that makes so much sense. Yes.
Yeah. So the early patterns, if you have a look at them, they're like really hard to follow and really hard to, and they do leave out information that would have been really obvious to a person who was living in the 1840s that is not obvious to a person who's living now, like what you're aiming for. They know what a garter looks like. So they, you know, they know where it's going to fit on the leg. So they know they can measure on, perhaps if they're making it for themselves, they know where they need it to sit and how, you know, big the leg is at that point, you know, that sort of stuff. So And these, we're now talking like these patterns, the first patterns were published like 1840, 1838, 1840. So this is quite a long time after Jane Austen was writing. So patterns would have been passed on earlier by copying an existing object or having a sampler. If you wanted to make like a lace pattern, you'd copy a sampler.
Or having someone like Mrs. Bates teach you
how to do it. Yeah. And lots of the other early patterns give the instruction to knit like a garter. In other words, to use what we would call garter stitch, which is what you get when you knit back and forth without purling. And that gives you a really stretchy fabric, which would make a great garter. So
makes so much sense.
It was much harder to learn these things than the day before a YouTube tutorial.
Sure. Although every second person could do it. So you could get your YouTube tutorial by like walking into your neighbor's living room and say, show me.
You had the live and in-person version, you know, which is even better.
Which is way better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't need to do the pause, repeat, like rewind.
Yeah.
So it definitely sounds like knitting was very much part of education for most young women during this time period, and that probably even if she hadn't learned it from her grandmother already, that she might have learned it from the governess who was teaching her and Miss Campbell, do you think?
Sure, yeah. It would have been thought of as being a kind of, because even if you weren't going to knit your own stockings, but one of your servants was going to knit your stockings, you had to know how to do it so that you knew that they were doing it properly. And so even very elite women had to know how to do all of these skills, plain sewing, decorative sewing, all that sort of thing, so that they could oversee servants and other people in their care to do it.
So definitely part of the education, but perhaps, at least during this time period, not thought of as like a braggable accomplishment in the sense of...
Sure, absolutely not. No, It wouldn't have been that.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
The other interesting thing is when you do start getting books about knitting and crochet and things like that, one of the things that is often repeated in like the introduction or the preface is how the holding the needles or the crochet hook and bending your head down to look at your work is a great opportunity to show off your beautiful hands and the back of your neck. Your hair's all up, so the back of your neck looks very alluring as you bend your head forwards. So that's one of the reasons they become an accomplishment. It's got nothing to do with the thing you're actually doing. It's how you look while you're doing it.
It's the pose. This tracks. It really does.
It's the harp of the handicraft world, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like, how hot can I look whilst I work on this project?
Yeah.
Do you see my dainty hands? Do you see my elegant neck? I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So good. And you said that this was in some of those publications.
Yeah. And it tells you. So there's two ways of holding knitting needles, and the way that's more practical is to hold them. I'm trying to think, because you hold your cutlery differently. It's to hold it. So I'm just to hold it
like
from
Americans. What are we doing?
To hold it from above, like a bit like holding the handlebars of a bike.
Right.
So you're holding them like that, and then you can manipulate them. But all the books that talk about this ask you to hold them more like a pen, so the needle comes across your hand, which is totally impractical because where's the actual knitted bit you've already done going to sit?
Right.
Your hands are in the way. But because if you hold the two knitting needles like as though they were two pens, your hands look more elegant.
Practicality. Who needs it?
Yeah, that falls quite completely to the wayside. And the other important thing is that the thing that you're making when you're being seen to be making must be beautiful and useful-ish, but not too useful.
It's a fine line we have to be.
It's a really fine line. It mustn't be something that you have to do. No, like hemming a sheet, even though you have to hem sheets. Do you have to do that in private? If you're going to do it in company, it has to be something beautiful, decorative, useful-ish to show that you're going to be a useful wife, but not too useful, because that's servants.
Aha. I like the idea of it's like, okay, hold the knitting needles, in this kind of more elegant way for the fancier stuff. But I mean, go ahead and just really do the most inelegant but practical hand position for when you're knitting those socks in private.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're cranking out the socks in the evening and nobody's around,
Yeah, because when I would presume that holding the needles in the less practical way, it's probably slower, right? Like you're not going to be able to knit as quickly.
It's slower. And if you're knitting something big, it's actually impossible.
Well, we can't talk about knitting in Austen without discussing the mention of knitting in Persuasion. So in that novel, Mrs. Smith tells Anne that Nurse Rooke taught her to knit. And so this is from that novel. As soon as I could use my hands, she taught me to knit, which has been a great amusement. And she put me in the way of making these little thread cases, pin cushions, and card racks, which you always find me so busy about, and which supply me with the means of doing a little good to one or two very poor families in this neighborhood. She has a large acquaintance, of course, professionally, among those who can afford to buy, and she disposes of my merchandise. So here we have Mrs. Smith knitting and selling her wares in order to help financially support some of the families in her neighborhood. Can you talk to us about the types of objects Mrs. Smith is knitting and how this scene fits in with this broader context of what we know about knitting during this time and these kind of cottage industries?
Sure. So it's interesting that Mrs. Smith is a bit like Mrs. Bates. She occupies a sort of liminal space between different echelons of society. She's neither one thing nor another. And they're both women who've fallen on hard times. So it's interesting that Jane Austen has chosen to give them both knitting.
Right.
So the kind of objects that Mrs. Smith is making would have been appropriate to her status as a genteel lady. But she's subverting that a bit by selling her makes for charity.
Right. Having a financial element at all is kind of the subversive part.
Yeah. So I'm going to read you a little quote from Sandy Byrne's 2014 book, Jane Austen's Possessions and Dispossessions, The Significance of Objects. So she says, quote, Mrs. Smith's production of this particular item, and she's talking about thread cases, is part of a code that Austen uses to signal to her readers that this item falls into the category of products that a woman of the gentility might make, but ordinarily only for family members and singular friends, end quote. So she's making elite items. She's also not debasing herself by supplementing her own income by knitting. Even though she's really fallen on hard times, she's not supporting herself. Rather, she's supporting herself emotionally by keeping herself occupied and by the feeling of doing a little good. And there's loads of modern evidence that knitting can be really positive for mental health. So, it tracks that Jane Austen knew what she was talking about. And that making fancy work items, which is what these would have been, they're called fancy work. Making fancy work items to sell for charity became a big thing in the 19th century, a bit later. So Mrs. Smith was perhaps a bit ahead of the curve. And as for what she made, so thread cases would be used to hold sewing and other threads, which they didn't come yet neatly wound around a wooden reel or spool. They would come in a hank, and so you had to store them really carefully so they didn't get tangled. And pin cushions, which is the second thing that she makes, those weren't just for needlework. Pins were a really vital part of fastening clothing, so a pin cushion would live on the dressing table of both men and women. And because pins are associated with clothing, a pin cushion is a really intimate object, so they were often made as tokens of affection between, young lovers, that sort of thing. Now, I haven't come across a knitted card rack, but the anonymous 1845 Ladies' Work Table book has a pattern or receipt, which is what patterns were called, receipts or recipes back then, for a crocheted card basket and a card case. And there's another receipt for a card case in Knitting, Crochet and Netting, written by the fabulously named Eleanor de la Branchadier in 1846. And all of those are for holding calling cards. So card rack was for displaying them, just like Elizabeth Elliot displays the cards of the Dowager Viscountess Dalrymple and the Honourable Miss Carteret as visibly as possible. So she's making elite items, and she's slightly subverting that by selling them, but only a little bit. And I'm guessing probably because Mrs. Rook is actually doing the selling, it may be that the people buying them don't know who's made them.
Got it. Yeah.
You know, so she's keeping that private to herself and obviously, you know, people like Anne who she's friends with. But so it wouldn't be known that she was making them, perhaps. So it wouldn't be a slight on her kind of, her status or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's so interesting that we're kind of going in this circle, right? Where it's like, okay, you're doing this handicraft that maybe previously was perceived as, you know, less elite, but you are making elite items, but you're selling them, but you're not keeping the money, you know?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's really completely in keeping with her liminal status.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting that, so there's another character we haven't talked about much who can knit, and that's Mrs. Rook. The nurse.
Right. Yeah, because she's the one who's teaching.
Yeah. So she's, as far as we know, she's a lower class, not a really low class woman, but she's a lower class woman. And so she, I'm guessing, would have learnt knitting more as a practical thing, but she's learnt how to make these elite objects, or she's figured out how to make them because she's got an example and she knows how to knit, you know, and she's put the two together and worked it out. So she's also subverting class by knitting up to the class scale, you know, or at the very least being able to teach Mrs. Smith how to knit objects that are appropriate to Mrs. Smith's status.
Social class. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really fascinating little nuance.
Yeah. And so the earliest knitting and crochet books kind of had a stock kind of items that they would have patterns for. It would be like caps, which was like a lacy white bonnet that would go under your outdoor hat. So that's what a cap means. Caps, anything that could be kind of made lacy. So like muffetees, which are what we would call wrist warmers, sometimes with a thumb hole, sometimes they just stop below the thumb. Purses, loads of knitted and crocheted purses of both the sort that are what is called a short purse, which has a clasp or a drawstring, and a long purse, which has, there's loads of long purses in the most recent Emma adaptation, has fantastic knitted bags and purses in it, if you're interested. And so the long purse is like a tube that's closed at both ends, but with a slit in the middle and two rings that hold the ends closed. And there's loads of patterns for those. So the early books have the same items repeated. And then as the 1840s progresses, the pattern designers and writers, who are all women, probably all women, there might be one man, but he might just have his name on it and it's actually a woman's work. But they start to become really innovative, and you start getting patterns for more interesting, more kind of, think of a thing, can I make it with knitting or crochet?
Sure, yeah.
Like bell pulls and petticoats and you know, hundreds of trims and borders and insertions, which are little like lacy bits you put in the middle of fabric. So they're kind of trying to come up with more and more things that they can provide patterns for. I mean, if you can put a cozy on it, they made a cozy for it in the Victorian era.
Of course.
I mean, you think people are bad for an iPhone cozy and an iPad cozy and a coffee cup cozy. Well, that's nothing. If it stays still, you put a cozy on it.
If they could make a tiny little sweater for it, they definitely did.
Absolutely.
I'm now just thinking of a bell pull for General Tilney.
Right?
I mean, if he's fashionable enough, he'll have one. So.
Well, Eleanor, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about knitting in Jane Austen. Where can our listeners find you online or follow along with your projects? And I know that there were also some books that you wanted to mention as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to, the history of knitting is like such a massive subject, and it's a really interesting subject. It's really interesting, I think, because it's a lot about women, and there's not a lot of history that's like a lot about women. So I really like it. So there's 3 books that I thought I would mention because they're books that I found really helpful. The first is by Richard Rutt, and it's called A History of Hand Knitting. It's really readable, a little bit out of date, and it's probably out of print, but you can find copies secondhand really easily. It was written in the 1980s. Richard Rutt was an Anglican priest who had an interest in knitting and thought, I know, I'll just write a history.
Okay.
And then there's a more modern book by Sandy Black called Knitting, Fashion, Industry and Craft. It's quite hefty and at the scholarly end. Perhaps want to borrow from the library because I suspect it's quite expensive to buy. But ask your local libraries to get it in, because then everybody can read it. And then the third one is by Esther Rutter, and it's like 2 or 3 years old. And it's called This Golden Fleece, A Journey Through Britain's Knitted History.
Excellent.
And it's a modern memoir about knitting with a good dose of history thrown in, and it's very readable. And I've met Esther, and she's absolutely brilliant. So
Fabulous.
the best place to find me is on Instagram, where I'm at Stitches and Seeds. And there you can find links to things I've written and places I've spoken about the history of crochet. And I also post about interesting textile things that I come across and places that I swim and my garden.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. Again, it's been just absolutely lovely to get to talk to you about knitting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Oh, it's been so fun.
Thank you again to Eleanor Gilchrist for joining us for this episode. You can find us on our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, and email us at thingaboutaustin@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at thethingaboutaustin, and you can check out our merch for the podcast on Redbubble. Go to aboutaustin.redbubble.com.
Stay tuned for next episode when we'll be talking about cottages.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.